Why do I have a suit on today? Well, maybe it's fitting. I mean, I'm going to a conference in a little bit here, so that's the reason. But maybe it's fitting because I'm going to put on the economist hat today and talk about the tech job cycle. Some of you might know that in a past life, I played the role of economist as well, spent a decade building a startup in the wealth tech space where we did a lot of analytics on like macroeconomics, etc. But let's talk specifically about the tech job cycle. And we'll break it down into phases starting, from late 2019, early 2020 to the present, and where do we go from here? So most of you know that there was sort of a period of overhiring, a boom. Unless you started your career and that feels normal to you, unless you started your career in those pandemic years, you know that boom felt a little bit over the top, a little bit unnatural. What was really happening there? Why did that happen? And then how did we get where we are now? Well, the overhiring that happened in the tech industry, in other industries as well, but certainly it was really exacerbated in the tech industry in the pandemic 2020 to 2022. What happened there was the following. So you have a couple of different key factors. You have the pandemic occurring, and what does that do? Well, that leads to a return of zero interest rates, right? So the Fed cuts rates rapidly down to zero. Actually, if I were to put that on a chart, they went like this. They weren't very high before the pandemic. They had just started hiking and trying to get it to be normal. But they basically did this. They went straight to zero as soon as the pandemic hits and they realized that, oh, wow, this is a crisis. We need to do something. So rates go straight to zero. But that's not the only thing that happens. First of all, what happens when rates go to zero? That leads to, here, if I change this from being a rates chart, I will change it to being a money supply chart. So this is money supply. And money supply is literally just how much money there is in the economy overall. And then this is time. So let's say this is 2020, and then this is 2024. And so what happens here is we get zero interest rates, which drives up money supply because people are able to borrow more easily. And banks actually create money. I'm not going to get into a whole explanation of fractional reserve banking, but that actually creates money whenever you borrow money from a bank, when a business does, when a private consumer does. So that zero interest rate policy led to some amount of increase of money supply. Then the second thing that happens is then we have another rocket booster, which is the Fed directly intervening because they were so concerned about the economic crash during the pandemic. So then we have Fed intervention. So here might be the drop in interest rates leading to this initial kind of uptrend. So I'll call that ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. Then we've got more rocket fuel from what we'll call Fed intervention. And basically the Fed added various estimates, somewhere on the order of a high single-digit number of trillions of dollars, somewhere between $5, $6-7 trillion were added. So a huge amount of money flowed in via the Fed. And so this is this rocket ship, continuing. ZIRP starts it, Fed intervention. And then you have a third booster. So this is like a three-stage rocket. You've got this third booster, which is government. Now, you may think, hey, the government is the Fed, right? But here I'm talking about Congress, I'm talking about the president, talking about all of the stimulus that was done, like all the pandemic checks and all the pandemic money for businesses. There was trillions handed out. So this is government stimulus. So there's really three boosters on this rocket sending money supply straight up. And so that's kind of what happened. And now it's started to come down, but slowly. If we mark ourselves as this is like pre-pandemic, we are less than sort of halfway back. Now, it should be noted, we don't need to get all the way back to that level. As the economy grows over time, you expect the money supply to grow some too. But we're way above a normal trend line of where you'd expect to be. So we're still quite elevated. At any rate, this rocket boost here, this led to there being money everywhere. So what did that do? That meant that the valuations of startups skyrocketed. The valuations of companies, in the stock market, you may recall that in early 2020, there was a brief crash. And then the market from there proceeded to rally and rally strongly throughout the pandemic. In particular, tech stocks skyrocketed. And the kinds of tech stocks that were benefiting from a pandemic where you're working from home, so think Zoom And, actually all of these companies, it was including Microsoft, including even the hardware players, think the Dells and the HPs of the world to some extent, because they were selling a lot of laptops. Tech was needed, whether it was hardware, whether it was software. So across the board, you have an explosion. And then you have an explosion of hiring as one of the inevitable results of that, all the way to the point of it being overhiring, because you have every aspect of the tech economy, from the old school companies, the sort of big Fortune 500 companies, to the tech giants. That's the Facebooks of the world and the Twitters. Well, not really Twitter, but Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, all of those big players. And then the second tier players like the Twitters as well. All of them overhiring. And then you have the VC money flooding in so that startups are overhiring. So bloat across the board. And you see that in the total number of jobs in the tech world skyrocketing as well. So if we look at it from that perspective, then we see a scenario in which salaries, well, if we look at it from a total jobs perspective over time, we kind of have this rise with the pandemic and then a plateau, and then it's been kind of falling and kind of steady state now. If that's kind of what happened in that time frame, well, salaries did the same thing. And so we had this huge surge, and then we get to the top, and we'll talk next about the inevitable correction from that.